Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to episode 308 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Pilar, and if you are a regular listener, you're going to love this. I am so happy that you can join me for this conversation, which is a meaty one and a long one. I recorded with Rachel Happe, who is a consultant helping leaders in organizations to boost engagement, but really boost engagement within the organization by building connections between employees, using the online space to build internal communities across the organization. So very meaty stuff. And then, of course, leveraging these communities for the good of the organization, not simply to use them for more top-down messages. So if you are thinking of how to connect people across your organization, then this is the episode for you. But a big warning, we cover the principles behind this, not exactly the how-to, because you first need to get the foundations right before we start to decide to open up this new online space and create all these conversations. Actually, are we ready for it? What needs to be in place before that? So there's a lot that you need to understand about your organization, and you have to be very honest in what you're really trying to do. And there's no right or wrong. It depends what you want to do. If you just want people across the organization to have an online water cooler where they can connect on personal matters, that will need one kind of strategy, which will be very different to really providing a space where people can connect through the work beyond the teams, and where they can drive initiatives and actions to help them stay engaged. So, as Rachel says, it's not a question of turning on Yammer, for example, which is Microsoft's social enterprise network, and then seeing what happens. It really does need a whole strategy behind it. And just a little bit of background, I met Rachel in person at a conference in Lisbon, the Social Now conference, and talk about impostor syndrome, feeling like, oh my God, I was just in a room, because it was in person, with people who've been looking at how to build online communities and how to just create better workspaces by really engaging people with stuff that matters to them and really helping them connect with each other and across each other and with the purpose of the organization, etc. So I was really humbled, and so I'm delighted to have Rachel. So also a big shout out to Anna Neves, who's the brains and energy behind the Social Now conference. And if you want to find out more about that conference, but also listen to Anna talking about really capturing knowledge within the organization, then you must listen to bonus 297. And it was a bonus because it was one of those conversations that just grew, and we were supposed to be a 10-minute for the What's Going On episodes. And then it's just like, no, this needs to be its own episode. Yeah, so episode 297, it was released on the 31st of March, 2022. Well, that's all from me. I hope you enjoy the conversation and that you take from it as much as I did. Here's Rachel. I'm going to go straight into the meat of this, Rachel. And then as we go along, I'm sure listeners will get to know you and what you do, especially. But I cannot resist starting with the stuff on your website, because I think it resonated. But also I'd love to hear why, when we land on your website, we hear this. So I'm just going to read it out. It says, information and access have democratized. Organizations have not. The volume and speed of information have dramatically shifted power dynamics, increased friction, and escalated anxiety. Organizations have an unprecedented opportunity to transform by prioritizing community-centric cultures that boost trust, innovation, and engagement. Why are we greeted with this statement on your site?
I think one of the things that I did with my website is I want people to self-validate out. So if people aren't there to figure out how to distribute power and really think about engaging people in a different way, I'm not that interested in just slapping a solution on. I'm interested in actually solving a problem. So I think part of it was to really state firmly what I am interested in pursuing, which is changing the power dynamic and the way we think about how we work.
And when you're saying the power dynamic, as reference to organizations, what could that look like when that shifts?
Yeah, so it's a lot more self-advocacy and self-determination on the part of an employee. And management and leadership shift from kind of having the answer and telling people what to do to managing the environment so that people are empowered and that decision happens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty big mindset shift in what I'm doing when I'm running the organization. I don't have to be the subject matter expert. I need to be good at collaborative decision making and facilitating, because that process is challenging. And if you don't do it well, you get to this consensus environment where nothing ever happens. So it's a really ambiguous skill set, I guess, that's not particularly well documented, but we've seen part of the reason I started the CR in 2009 was because I saw these early community managers, and some of them were leading these open source communities that were building WordPress, which is used by like 40% of websites in the world now, right? That wasn't built by Microsoft or Oracle or what have you, right? So clearly there's a way to lead and manage where you can get really high productivity without kind of using extrinsic forcing functions on employees.
Yeah, it's a huge mindset shift as well to think like that. And I think you probably have to be a kind of, especially if you're thinking about organizations that are started and then grow, a kind of founder, a type of founder. And then also you have to be a kind of specific kind of person if you're coming into a role where maybe this has not been the way in which we've operated for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a startup, but one of my clients right now is a 60,000 person organization, and they've got, I don't know if I want to call it progressive thinking, but it's a very honest culture in that they're not trying to have a lot of smoke and mirrors. They're trying to actually work together and get something done. And there's a modesty there that people aren't as controlling. That doesn't mean they aren't used to some very outdated management practices that are getting in the way. But there's an opening to shift that mindset. They're already kind of there, but they haven't fully articulated it, if that makes sense. And they don't realize some of the organizational barriers to really excelling in that way, right? So financial systems, governance, how we do professional development. There's a whole lot of stuff wrapped into that structure.
Yeah, maybe there's a gut feeling that this is, that there is a different way of doing it. But like you say, we don't even have the language for talking about what that would look like. Or like you say, all the systems and barriers and stuff that's there, and it was there for a good reason. However, if we want to move forward. So I love that you said did you say humility or did I hear? Yeah, I think so. So we're really looking at organizations who, again, you weren't sure if they have progressive thinking, but there's a culture of openness, humility, and just saying, look, that we're willing to go with this. It's going to be painful, I imagine.
And actually, a lot of what I do is coaching at a very micro level, because it shows up in how you talk to each other, how you run meetings, how you think about project planning, how you think about conversations with your team, all of that stuff. It really pervades. Even if a company is trying to go that direction, it pervades so much of our business culture that it's really hard to get ourselves out of that.
It sounds fascinating. I want to come back to, maybe we can have a bit more detail of how, some of the things that you do and that you come across when you work. But you did mention something, and I just want to make sure. You said you founded, was it CR in 2000 something?
The Community Roundtable. So I'm no longer there. I'm at Engaged Organizations, but it's a research and professional development organization that works with community managers to really develop that profession. But I saw a lot of the skills that were practiced in that profession as needed for this next generation organization. And so what I was doing was studying them and really figuring out what this community management was. And for a long time, I was saying, well, community management is the future of all management. And when I said that in like 2004, people would look at me and be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And in the last 5 years, I get more and more nods and like, oh yeah. And COVID really helped people understand that quite a bit more.
Yeah, great, good, and we'll come back. We'll come back to that, because I think that is a concept that we haven't touched on. I think we've talked about it internally with some of my collaborators. This whole concept, as you say, of community management, especially in remote teams. But we'll come back to that. But let's go back, and also what led you to this. To what you're doing now is also interesting. So 2 things. Sorry, I always throw this stuff and then, okay, what do we start with first? So I'll leave it up to you. You can either start with how you end up here, or what does your work with organizations look like at the moment?
So the first question is kind of a long and winding road, because I've been, I guess, a little opportunistic in my career. And 15 years into my career, I was like, what am I doing? This isn't really consistent. or it felt a little kind of zigzaggy. And then part of the reason I started the CR is all of a sudden my Venn diagrams came together. And there was this thing in the middle that I had a unique perspective on that so many people didn't. So what that meant in reality is I grew up with parents, one of whom was a community organizer who ran part of the Nestle boycott, which was one of the few successful corporate boycotts that's happened, at least in recent times. And my father was a congregational minister. And in that church governance, the congregation hires and fires its minister. So you lead by tacit authority, like you have no control over people. In fact, they have more control over you. So you have to really be quite sophisticated about how you kind of massage things, I guess.
Yes.
And that was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and people love to argue here. So there was a contention there as well. So it was a feisty congregation. So I grew up watching that, and because my dad was the minister, a lot of the meetings happened at our house in the evening. And when I was really small, I liked being in on the deacons meeting. That was the governing board. And people would just let me because they're like, she's harmless, like whatever. And I just was fascinated by the power dynamics from a very early age. Anyway, so then I ended up studying politics, which isn't surprising given that, and international relations. Well, I was an analyst in DC for a few years, and then I got into management consulting. And I was doing benchmarking and analytics, looking at huge companies, new product development, and supply chain operations. So really, how do companies operate, and how do the better companies operate? And they spun off a enterprise software company in the 90s. And I had gotten into business school, and then I was doing this project with this spinoff. and they offered me a product management job. And this was the .com boom.
Yes.
And I was looking at these two things and I was like, business school will be here if I want it again. An opportunity to get into a startup, given my background, may not.
Yeah.
So I went that direction. And we were doing some really interesting co-innovation portals and portfolio management stuff that was 20 years ahead of its time. And that company eventually died because there just wasn't enough market for it. But it was one of the early SaaS companies. And then I ended up in Silicon Valley, and I found a role at a e-payment startup. And it was right about the same time that LinkedIn and Friendster and all of that other stuff was bubbling around Orchid. And I was working on a partnership with Microsoft, seeing how digital incentives could get people to do in that case. One of the things they wanted people to do was download instant messenger. And how much money did you need to give people? So anyways, I was in that firmament and on the management team of this organization doing product strategy and partnership management. That role was just a ton of fun. And actually, I built a social network while we were there too around independent music because we were trying to figure out how micropayments were going to be used in a variety of ways.
So when you say you built a social network around, did you say music?
Yeah, it was independent music. So we were trying to help people figure out how to share and buy independent music.
Okay.
Which is always a problem because it's not well known, right? So we had really rich personal profiles where you could build virtual mixtapes and share them with people.
Yeah.
And so then I was hired by IDC to run it was a new social software research practice. I had to build the first forecast of that market. And this was white label social media. It wasn't Twitter or Facebook. It was, I'm buying a platform and using it as an organization. And I had a wonderful boss, Sue Feldman, there, who was an enterprise search expert. And we used to have just the most fascinating conversations and arguments about content and access and how people found things. And these were the days where Google was just like the shining star. And at some point, I remember telling her, I was like, well, people are going to find more content through social networks than they are through search. And she was like, everybody I said that to was like, no way. And I was like, well, people hunt and they gather. And if they don't know what they don't know, there's a whole world of things you don't know. And it's much bigger than the world of what you can articulate. And I think I had left at that time, but I remember when that Facebook kind of like that dynamic overwhelmed search, and I had to send her a note and be like, Sue, see? But she was amazing. And she sent me to MIT class on systems dynamics modeling, which changed how I thought about dynamics of systems, right? So it wasn't just using the software, it was understanding kind of feedback loops and interrelationships and all of this other stuff. And so I used that to build my first forecast, which at the time, the vendors wouldn't even tell you how much they were making because it was so little. Anyways, I didn't last very long as an analyst because I was kind of like, if I believe this, I don't want to sit here and talk about people doing it. I want to go do it. And so I ended up at a company, head of the product group of a company who was trying to combine and integrate an LMS with a social network. So social learning communities, essentially. But they were buying a bunch of companies and trying to integrate them. And that was a little bit of a hot mess as it was. And then 2008 hit and the bottom fell out of the market. And that's when we started coming up with this idea for the CR. And that's when I was looking at this and saying, oh, okay, I have the community piece. I have the power piece, so the power dynamics. I've got the tech piece and I've got the business operations piece. And so I've got a unique lens on how this is all going to come together.
Wow, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. In hindsight, it seems
in hindsight.
intentional, but it wasn't.
We always end up going, yeah, this is what I'm meant to be doing. So yeah, maybe this is the person you've grown into, through all the experiences and landed fantastic, whatever. Excellent. So then what does your job look like now? I mean, you've been telling us about the kind of people that you might end up working with, and we've even, thanks for sharing that there's an organization you're working with now, and one of the stuff that's happening there. So what happens? I mean, I'm sure it's different every time, but what happens when you start to work with an organization? What are some of the issues that you're looking at? Some of the problems?
So usually when I come into the organization, it's for a workshop or a relatively short-term thing. And that makes sense. We're getting to know each other, and they've usually got a problem that they're starting off with. And the problem might be an engagement problem. It might be a lot of the companies that I've done strategy workshops with over the years have an internal community of practice network, but they're not getting engagement, or they realize they have to train the leaders of these communities of practice because they're not doing what the hope was. They're not generating the value that was intended to be generated. So that's a great deal of who I come in. So some of that is I come in and I train those leaders. And some of the time it's come in and help them build a strategy or the next gen of their strategy and their roadmap so that they can really get there and they understand all the things that go into making that successful. So one example is I was working with a European company, and they had this community of practice network. And initially, I had been doing training with them. And then they had asked us to help them build a playbook. So new community of practice leaders would have a guide. And I knew them a fair bit by then. And we got in a room and we were tackling and I kept asking them, how do communities start? Like, why does a community start? How does it start? And they weren't understanding my question. And I thought it might be a language issue. I wasn't sure. And then all of a sudden, one of the people in the room was like, oh, well, communities don't start organically. Like somebody decides that we need one and tells somebody to lead this community. And I was like, oh, that's why you have engagement issues. Like no one actually feels like they need this community except for somebody high up in the organization.
Oh, there's so much stuff there. So let's start with some of that. So why you said that sometimes the communities of practice, well, they're not realizing what whoever they wanted to set them up or what the organization or someone in the organization was expecting. So what are some of the things that people are expecting communities of practice to give an organization?
They really want social learning from it at the core, right? They want expertise sharing. They want the organization to know what the organization knows. Some community of practice networks aren't even digitally enabled at all, really. Sometimes they have a website or a listserv or whatever, but they're not places you engage online. The engagement happens in meetings where people share things. So there's often this very transactional nature to them rather than this democratized sharing of information. And one of the things that I've seen across a lot of my clients, and ironically, it's even more so in organizations where knowledge is the product. So service organizations or research or whatever, there is this very strong subject matter expertise culture and ownership of the truth. And it's usually very narrowly defined. You need the certificates, you need the role, you need the degree, you need something. And everybody else doesn't know anything. And the subject matter expert is the final word. And that is a very rigid hierarchical way to think about things. And you actually end up losing a lot of innovation capacity when you do that, because one person has one mindset, one set of experiences. Like, so if they're the truth, you're kind of limiting yourself to what they know.
Yeah, and we can see it's back to what we were talking about earlier, that the mindset when we're looking at this is really, have we got as an organization the right mindset for this?
Well, so, and the irony with that particular thing, that dynamic, is somebody new in the organization, the best learning for them doesn't come from subject matter experts. They don't even know what the subject matter expert is talking about, right? Like, they're like, I don't know. That's not a problem I deal with, right? It's like way out there. The best person for them to learn from is the person right in front of them who just learned the thing, because it's still fresh in their mind how they used to think about something and what it took, like the pathway they took to change it. And so you're getting to this environment where everybody has something to teach and everybody has something to learn. And it's a matter of matchmaking, right? Getting that person who can best help or best listen to you.
And this is something that many organizations, especially those that have adopted remote or hybrid ways of working since the pandemic, this is their worry, is that they know how to do this, or they're used to how these dynamics play out in the office space. But how do they play out in these other spaces? And I think that's this is what a lot of organizations are struggling with. But I think that before they start to think about that, I think you really need to look at, as you were saying, look at themselves and say, okay, is this the right environment for this kind of thing to thrive? Or where can we start? What is some of the things that we need to do to start with?
Yeah. And to me, one of the interesting things with the pandemic is teams are just small communities, right? Essentially. And managers and leaders, executives, people making decisions about the organization, took relationships for granted, because people came in the office and they bumped into each other and they chatted and they went to lunch and whatever. And that's always been very implicit versus explicit. And when you go remote, everything needs to be explicit. Yet managers have never set up regular social hours. And so what happens is people still need that connection. So you end up having a zillion meetings because people want to see and talk to each other. But you're confusing things. You're like, if this is just a status update, I can do that online. And I should have an hour or two every week where we just get together and chit chat. And that's okay, right? It's okay not to be doing work every single hour of the day, because those relationships matter to trust. It is an environmental requirement for good collaboration that people feel like they can talk to each other authentically.
Yeah. And I'd also say with that example as well, if we are having the status updates because we need connection, let's recognize that so that we know that, so that we can then design those status updates to get the connection we want.
That's what I'm saying. We have all these meetings and none of them really satisfy, because we're not actually doing the thing that we need, which is just connecting. But we're having them because we want to see, we have that urge, but we can't admit it to anybody because we're so wrapped up in the ROI of every single minute of the day that we can't just step back and be like, let's just chat.
And so this concept of online communities and within the enterprise, the social enterprise networks, and how this gets built. For someone who's never experienced or been thinking about this, how does an organization that is really leveraging the power of the online space to create these networks so that people throughout the organization can network and form communities, what does it look like? What is like a really good case of what this might look like?
So it's interesting because the software is changing, and I would maintain that collaboration network software has never had the governance structure to fully do what it needs to be done, right? What huge companies need is they need to build New York City. Where are the roads? Where's the little area for dumplings? And where are the parks? And where are the this, that, and other thing? And how do people get between one and the other easily? Like, how do they understand where they're going and what's related to each other? In the digital space, especially when it's not physical, you can't see how things are connected. You need a lot of guidance to kind of understand that. And if you don't have that map, things get repeated again and again and again because people can't find what's already there. And so an example of this is this client was using one of the best platforms in the market. They had different kinds of spaces, which was great, but none of them were connected. So in the database, they were just unlinked. And they were asking us to assess and archive all the unengaged spaces. And we literally had to go into the database and pull that because there was nowhere we could just get the list of everything that's there. So that's an example of the software doesn't support visibility, which is like kind of mind-blowing a little bit if you call yourself an enterprise collaboration platform. And actually, before I started the CR, I was starting to think about this, which is how do communities friend each other? And when are they nested and when are they equal? And how do they determine what knowledge and documentation overlap and what is separate? Because that's really what you need in a large organization, which is you need that connective tissue to know how to get from where you are to where you want to go. And right now, what's really popular and really fairly well used is team chat, because it's a dynamic everybody can understand and it's the people they work with most of the time. But none of those team spaces are connected. So how do I find the other teams that are doing the stuff that I am doing that could possibly share best practices? So it depends. The size of the organization matters. How digitally, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that. But somebody needs to think about that architecture.
That's the thing, is that like what I'm getting from a lot of what you're saying is it's not enough to turn on Yammer within an office. And it's not enough to have someone looking after the discussion and animating it, or promoting conversations and even promoting the connections. That's not enough. I think this concept of thinking of that shared online space between everyone in the organization not being like the office, but like you said, like a city. Yeah. And it's a lot more difficult to navigate than an office. Love that.
Yeah. And actually, I think one of the things that I've found, because I have that enterprise software background too, is companies right now don't have these enablement teams. And whether you call them community enablement teams or collaboration enablement teams or a digital workplace enablement team, whatever you call it, they need to have this team that goes in and assesses the work patterns, figures out like how consistent that work pattern is and what are the exceptions and all of that, so that they can identify the tech stack that team needs, and then train that team on how to utilize, like, what I find today is companies are adopting all this enterprise technology, and they're just codifying the processes they have. And I'm like, but this technology enables you to do things in a fundamentally different way. And so if you're codifying what you have, you're just becoming more rigid in an environment that's changing. So, right? So some team who, and I've been pondering this idea of, we talk about digital literacy. And I'm like, I don't think digital literacy is knowing how to type into a tool. Like, everybody uses technology today. We all have computers. Digital literacy is understanding the architecture of technology and what it allows you to do that you can't, that you're constrained from doing today. But most companies don't even see that. A huge company I was working with, their Microsoft team in IT didn't understand the difference between Teams and Yammer. Fundamentally, like, so they really heavily promoted Teams, and Yammer was kind of like, oh, I guess you can use it, but we don't really understand why you would use it. That's the connective tissue.
Yeah, I've seen exactly that same thing. There's such different places to connect and such different places to converse.
But they look so similar from a functionality perspective. So people are looking at that superficial and saying they're exactly the same. And you're like, no, not at all. Right? Yes, structurally on the UX, they might look similar, but you're not doing the same thing when you're there.
Yeah. I wonder if there's there must be already like a new branch of anthropology or something, which is all about discovering. It's not just how we connect through technology, but like you said, I think that's so interesting and so important. And of course, many companies have done exactly that. They've moved how they worked before into the online space, and everything's crashing now because essentially, I think it might be because they see it as a hindrance still rather than the opportunity that it is. And it's not just, let's change the ways in which we work because we want to be digital. It's actually, look, you've got this stuff that's evolving by the minute, and it can allow us to do things differently.
Yeah, better, actually, in fact. And actually, like, I look at part of the reason I got into this is I was looking at, I used to hate what my dad did. I could never have done it. I didn't have the patience, like, to get any major decision. He'd have to go around and around in circles for a long time to get everybody on board. So we had hierarchies because we needed to process the information and distribute the information. And we didn't have that technology to do that for us. So we created these management hierarchies. Now the technology has leapfrogged. It can do the distribution, the content creation, the blah, 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 blah. What people they don't have the sense making, right? And these hierarchical organizations have done us a really big disservice because they've essentially told people or shown people that they're not equal. They're not two people don't have the same worth, which is really destructive to culture, right? When you think about it. So you're kind of stuck in this old mindset, in this old structure, and with a world where there's more and more information just overwhelming you, but the processes are rigid and slow, and like, it just blows your mind. Like, you're just overwhelmed all the time.
Yeah. And it strikes me that we need to, like you said, we need to understand why do we have those hierarchies, where do they come from, and how the context and the world was so different. And now, very quickly, it's changed, and they've become they become redundant. It's a big realization.
Yeah, and not like, John Husband will tell you this, not all hierarchy is bad. There needs to be people who are responsible for certain decisions at the end of the day, because you're never going to get 100% consensus. So you've got to go out, do some sense making, and then somebody's got to make the call and say, given what I heard, this is what we're doing.
Yeah. Definitely. So I'm going to look at my notes, which I haven't done for the whole show. Because this is just, I love these conversations because they go right into why I'm in the space. It's all about what can we provide? How can we create a different kind of world, in essence, within organizations to start with. But let's remember that so many of us spend so many time within organizations that actually, to change the world, you have to change the world of work. So what I'm going to do, I had a blog post that I wanted to discuss, but we covered a lot in here anyway. I will just touch on one thing, which is you touched on it very early on about this role of the community manager. So we'll just touch on it lightly, and then they can go to the blog post. But what is a community manager? Because some people will not really know what that is in the online space. And then why is that such an important new skill, whatever we want to call it, for a manager actually, or a company leader as well?
I'll start off by one of the things, and it gets to one of your other questions you had for me, which is community's been around for a long time. Why hasn't it caught on? Social media came in there and got really, really popular. And it formed the opinion of what online collaboration is. And social media is a dumpster fire of anxiety. I mean, you can control that if you know what you're doing, but if you don't kind of think about it, it's just a lot of anxiety. That's the emotional feeling you have when you use it, if you're not being really careful. Online communities feel 180% different. They're calm, they're joyful, but calm doesn't trigger people the way anxiety does, right? So to get people to come together in that calm environment, you've got to invest some time because they're not triggered to come in, right? So you've got to create prompts and reasons for them to come in and connect. You've got to go out and talk to them and build relationships yourself with them so that when something's happening, you can tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, could you come in? I think you have something to add here. So a lot of it is that on the surface side. And then on the back end side, it's structuring the space and it's figuring out the programs and the UX and the metrics and the governance and the yada, 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 right? So there's a lot of roles within that circle. But the real skill set that's missing is that helping people come together and have a conversation that is constructive about something that matters, right? Can we talk about some of these in the US? Abortion just got blown up, right? Abortion rights. How can we have a conversation about that where we're not just screaming at each other? Somebody has to be in the middle facilitating that. And so you can think of the community manager as that facilitator who's bounding the conversation, meaning here's the rules of engagement for us. And interestingly, what we've learned online that I think could be applied in the offline space is governance is better off when it's oriented to behavior, not content. So it's not that we're talking about a more explosive thing. It's that yelling at people is bad. Abusing people is bad. So if you can't have this conversation without doing those things, you can't be in the space with us. And then modeling how to have that contentious conversation in a respectful, constructive way.
And I suppose then from a team leader point of view, it's understanding how to use the space as well to bring people
Yep.
together, whereas we've probably used to, and especially for me, the non-real-time aspect of it. So how can we bring people together? How can we have the conversations we need to have in this way? And again, you mentioned the role of the facilitator hat, and this is really hard. And when can I step away and not guide this conversation, but facilitate it?
Yeah.
Which sometimes is very difficult.
And a lot of community managers get into the mistake of answering questions. And I'm like, you're not distributing power or getting people together. And the other mistake people make is they want it all hunky-dory and everybody agrees, right? And you're not going to get anything productive done without friction, right? Differences of opinion are what lead to new breakthroughs, right? So you want to have those conversations, but you want to do it in a way that's a negotiation versus a fight.
Yeah. And that's the other side of social media, is this artificial harmony that I saw a very long time ago when I was trying to introduce this digital workplace and that mindset of actually we can do a lot of what we do offline, online. But the person who was looking after Yammer, funnily enough, they were coming at it from a completely social media kind of point. So all that people in the project saw were pictures of the team having dinner together and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, where are the conversations about how difficult it is to do this?
I won't put this all on them because it happens across the spectrum. But when internal comms is the leader for internal networks, that is often the primary vein of, and because internal comms is kind of by nature one way, they're trying to get everybody to see the thing that the leaders are like, I'm simplifying. But it's not stuff that's meaningful to my everyday work and to my career. And so if it's not meaningful in a core way, it's superfluous. I can go engage or I cannot.
And in a way, you're duplicating, because the internal comms in your example becomes the owner of the community. It becomes their space, really.
Yeah.
It's just their space where they talk to people, not our space, as you're saying. Yeah, good. So you already started to answer that. That might be one of the, and I think you're completely right. I hadn't thought of that the fact that our experience of connecting online has been through social media. And I've seen this as well, that when we come to having conversations online, nobody takes it seriously because we think it's not serious work for all of that. Do you think we're ready now to start looking at this? I think it's a bit early, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Looking at what?
At whether organizations in the mainstream are ready to start looking at the concept of building internal networks and helping build online communities within their organization.
Well, so the clients I referenced before, the product group owns it. Not L&D, not internal comms, not HR. It's a product group initiative. And I think that matters because it's people who actually they have a job to do that is deeper and more complex and the value center of the organization in this case, right? And so that ownership does matter in the end. The challenge with product groups is you need that enablement role, and they're not the ops group. They're not one of the operations groups. So it's kind of the challenge with all internal community programs. Where does it sit? Because the whole organization is the umbrella community, and then there's internal comms communities and product communities and, training communities and whatever. So that hasn't been resolved.
Yeah. It's very complex, but anyone who's thinking of doing this, start thinking about it, assess the culture, have a look at small steps you can start doing. But know that because what we're dealing with in the end is not technology, it's humans. Mm-hmm. It's gonna be complex.
Yeah, and I think
beautiful.
You look out in the market and it's still such a tech-centric conversation.
Yes,
and
it is.
Tech is absolutely critical. But it's the bare minimum. It's not the potential. And so any vendor who is coming in and promising that their software will do this for you, software can absolutely help, but like it can't change your leadership, management, culture. Like it's not going to be enough.
Yeah. Well, those are very wise words to wrap up with. I will give you a bit of space in case there's anything else that you want to say before we wrap up. But listeners, I suggest you go to engagedorgs.com, and I will put a link in the show notes. But the title of this blog post that I think would be a great follow-up read, and in fact, great to read with your team, whether you're involved in this or not, because it brings up a lot of stuff. It's called Building a Hybrid Workplace, How Communities Transform Work. And it's from December the 3rd, 2021. Yeah, that's right. So, Rachel, so engagedorgs.com is a great place for people to see what you are doing, what you're advocating for, how to work with you. Any other space online that you would like them to connect with you?
LinkedIn is always good. I tweet a lot, but I get impassioned about politics. So I do tweet about my work, but if you don't want to hear that, if you don't want to hear my opinion about U.S. politics, it's probably not the space you're going to love. But I also have an Engaged Orgs Twitter handle. So it's Engaged Orgs on Twitter. And there I do keep it to work-related stuff. So that's probably the space on Twitter to go to.
Yeah, but the personal tweet, again, if you don't mind every now and then seeing someone go into politics as more of the personal opinions, I think you tweet out some really interesting questions as well that have to do with the way of work. So you've got both to check out, listeners. And anything else you want to say before we wrap up, Rachel Happe?
No, but thank you for having me. And it's a funny space, and right now I can't make sense of it because everybody's so wrapped up in the how do we create the hybrid workplace that this has kind of fallen off the radar a little bit. But the work so some of the clients I'm working with now, I'm just doing coaching, and it's so rewarding to see one of my program leaders has changed dramatically, in my opinion. When I started, she was very kind of rigid, all business, and she's just so much more relaxed now. And it's so nice to see her humanity. You know, that's kind of what drives me in the end is getting people to a place where they're excited and joyful and are not constantly anxious about what they're doing.
A big thank you to Ross Winter for polishing the audio of this episode. And thank you, listeners, for choosing to listen to the 21st Century Work Life podcast. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.